Born in Leadville, Colorado, about 120 miles southwest of Denver, the highest city in the United States, 10,200 feet above sea level. My mother grew up there. My dad grew up in Dubuque, but he went out there mining in the late 30s. Met my mother. My brother and I were both born in Leadville. Interesting enough, Leadville has the distinction of also being the home of Camp Hale. The 10th Mountain Division trained there during World War II. We came to Dubuque. Dad got tired of mining. 5 or 6 years, went back to work on the Mississippi as a riverboat man. So he worked on the barge lines. I went to grade school and high school in a small community of East Dubuque in the same building from 1st grade through 12th grade. I graduated from 1957 from East Dubuque High School. Interesting enough, some of my high school buddies as a senior joined a Naval Reserve unit here in Dubuque before I did. I didn't turn 17 till shortly before I graduated. And so I joined the Naval Reserve unit here in Dubuque when they were located out by the Lock and Dam in Quonset huts in 1957. That summer, I went to boot camp for 2 weeks at Great Lakes Training Center. And about a month later, I went on a 2-week training cruise on a small destroyer escort, the Daniel Joy, across Lake Michigan 4 times. And we fired our 5-inch guns. That was my battle station. A year later, I went on active duty in 1959. I had an obligation for 2 years, and I signed on for next year so I could go to some extra trainings. So I went to Philadelphia, and that's where I first saw the USS Iowa, and then I requested, they sent me to Great Lakes Training Center for Interior Communications Electrical School. We took care of gyro compasses, synchro systems, telephones, and anything to do with interior communications aboard the ship, as well as the general electrical plant. And shortly before we graduated from school, they interviewed us all for submarine training because at that time, in the mid to late 50s, we're converting from diesel electric to nuclear power for all submarines. So they were looking for people with skills that would manage the propulsion plants in submarines. So they interviewed me. I had never thought about going to submarine service until that interview. And fortunately, I was selected, and they sent me to submarine school. After I left the Great Lakes, I spent about 3 months at the submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. And then they flew me from there to Hawaii Pearl Harbor base. So our ship was stationed, home ported in Pearl Harbor. It had just arrived there while I was going to submarine school, and then it left there shortly thereafter. And so I went aboard it shortly after I arrived in Japan in the Western Pacific for a 6-month tour of duty in the Western Pacific in 1960. The USS Madrigal, M-E-D-R-E-G-A-L, Madrigal, SS-480. Some of us did not volunteer for nuclear power duty because they stayed at sea a long time, almost always submerged. We occasionally pulled into port once a month as a rule. Well, basically, life aboard a submarine is round the clock. You divide the crew into 3 groups, sections, and you go on duty for 4 hours at a time, and then you're off for 8 hours, round the clock. Our duty station was either in a control room as an electrician or in the maneuvering room, we called it. That's where we controlled the propulsion plant. And we had the sticks, that we called them, that would either take and direct electricity to charge the batteries or to drive the motors that drove the screws, watering the batteries, checking the motor generator plant that ran the AC power. We had 2 types of AC aboard our ship. 60 cycle, of course, for regular. We had DC electric powered emergency lights. We also had a 400 cycle generator that ran our main gyro compass on 400 cycles. So we took care of all the preventive maintenance during the daytime as a rule, and you took care of the equipment that was in trouble anytime it was in trouble. So a crew of about 98. But yeah, It's like riding in a bus without any windows. Now, one time, we inadvertently hit a seamount when in the Western Pacific, apparently an uncharted seamount. And I thought, well, this is cool. I remember going through one compartment to the next. The ship shook a little bit. I said, oh, this is cool. We're settling on the bottom. I didn't realize until later on we'd crashed in and took on about a ton or more of coral until I saw our ship in dry dock in Japan when we get our sonar dome repaired. We had a big sonar dome about 3 times larger than this table I'm sitting at in the lower level of our bow. And we scooped up about a ton or more of coral in there, put a big gash in there, as you might imagine, 4 feet across and 3 or 4 feet deep. So I was quite a surprise. And then we spent 6 months in the Western Pacific from Japan down to the equator. We had a presence in the Pacific with everything from aircraft carriers and their destroyers that protected them, as well as a variety of submarines. Our submarine was designed primarily at that time. It was converted to become a missile guidance submarine, as well as a traditional. We had 10 torpedo tubes aboard our ship, 6 torpedo tubes in the bow, and 4 torpedoes in the after torpedo room. At that time, one of our primary weapons was missiles. And unlike later wars that have launched a lot of missiles from submarines, fortunately we did not have to launch any, or wasn't required to launch any against Vietnamese. But had we been required to do so, our mission would have changed considerably. We were there as a support, protecting our supply ships, number one. We were there to protect the aircraft carriers, who did provide a lot of cover for our ground forces. There was a number of times when we took some special forces to sea with us. They would be deployed in their little black rubber rafts at night. They'd go ashore. Then we'd come back a week or so later and pick them up at a designated point. Don't know exactly what they did or what they were up to. Some of the duties that other submarines had were different than ours. At that time, we did have the capability of launching any nuclear missile that you can imagine towards our enemy. Some of these other submarines, their duty was also quite interesting. They would locate undersea cables, tap them, and we would be doing espionage, listening to communications from undersea cables. Yeah, when I got out of the Navy, I spent 6 months hitchhiking around the country for the first 3 months, visiting relatives and friends and shipmates' families, staying at their homes, visiting national parks and so forth, all the Pacific Northwest, till I ended up in Colorado. And then I came home to Dubuque for 3 months, turned down about 4 or 5 jobs. I decided to go in the Air Force. I was going to make a career in the military. So I transferred from my pay grade E5 as a petty officer second class to staff sergeant pay grade E5, and went directly to Cheyenne, Wyoming at Francis E. Warren Air Force Base, picked up my uniform, and joined the communications squadron there. Warren Air Force Base is a big missile base. We had the Minuteman missile primarily in about 50 to 70 miles in any direction. And we took orders out of Sac Air Force. It was a Sac Air Force Base. My responsibility in the Air Force was to dispatch maintenance people to the missile sites and around the Air Force Base to take care of any communications problems they had. Each Air Force missile site had its own small telephone exchange. So I went to schools in Wichita Falls, Texas, to Shepherd Air Force Base for about 3.5 months. The job I had in the Navy, the Air Force broke down into about perhaps 7 or 8 different jobs. The Air Force is much more specialized. The Navy, in order to save space and crew members, trains you to do a variety of things. Whether you're in the Air Force, the Marine Corps, Navy, or the Army, whatever your job is, we understand and respect each other's role. And I have to say that my heroes are the people in the infantry that are in the Marine Corps or in the Army or anybody on the ground, up front.